Chapter 4a of the Phenomenology of Mind, Volume 1 by Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, translated by James Black Bailey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4a, Independence and Dependence of Self-Consciousness, Lordship and Bondage. Translator's note. The self-conscious of self in another self are of course distinct and separate from each other. Difference is, and in the first instance, a question of degree of self-assertion and self-maintenance. One is stronger, higher, more independent than another, and capable of asserting itself at the expense of the other. Still, even this distinction of primary and secondary rests ultimately on their identity of constitution, and the course of the analysis here gradually brings out this essential identity as the true fact. The equality of the selves in the truth or complete realization of self in another self, the affinity, is higher and more ultimate than the disparity. Still, the struggle and conflict of selves must be gone through in order to bring out the result, hence the present section. The background of Hegel's thought is the remarkable human phenomenon of the subordination of oneself to another, which we have in all forms of servitude, whether slavery, serfdom, or voluntary services. Servitude is not only a phase of human history, it is in principle a condition of the development and maintenance of the consciousness of self as a fact of experience. End of translator's note. Self-consciousness exists in itself and for itself, in that, and by the fact that it exists for another self-consciousness. That is to say, it is only by being acknowledged or recognized. The conception of this, its unity in its duplication, of infinitude realizing itself in self-consciousness, has many sides to it and encloses within it elements of very significance. Thus its moments must be on the one hand strictly kept apart in detailed distinctiveness, and on the other, in this distinction, must at the same time also be taken as not distinguished, or must also be accepted and understood in their opposite sense. This double meaning of what is distinguished lies in the nature of self-consciousness, of its being infinite, or directly the opposite of the determinateness in which it is fixed. The detailed exposition of the notion of this spiritual unity in its duplication will bring before us the process of recognition. Self-consciousness has before it another self-consciousness. It has come outside itself. This has a double significance. First, it has lost its own self, since it finds itself as another being. Secondly, it has thereby sublated that other, for it does not regard the other as essentially real, but sees its own self in the other. It must cancel out this other. To do so is the sublation of that first double meaning, and it is therefore a second double meaning. First, it must set itself to sublate the other independent being in order thereby to become certain of itself as true being. Secondly, it thereupon proceeds to sublate its own self, for this other is itself. This sublation in a double sense of its otherness, in a double sense, is at the same time a return, in a double sense, to itself. For firstly, through sublation it gets back to itself, because it becomes one with itself again, through the cancelling of its otherness. But secondly, it likewise gives otherness back again to the other self-consciousness, for it was aware of being in the other. It cancels this in its own being out in the other, and lets the other go free. This process of self-consciousness in relation to another self-consciousness has, in this manner, been represented as the action of one alone. But this action on the part of the one has itself the double significance of being at once its own action and the action of the other as well. For the other is likewise independent, shut up within itself, and there is nothing in it which is not there through itself. The first does not have the object before it in the way that the object primarily exists for desire, but as an object existing independently for itself, over which therefore it has no power to do anything for its own behoof, if that object does not per se do what the first does to it. The process then is absolutely the double process of both self-consciousnesses. Each sees the other do the same as itself. Each itself does what is demanded on the part of the other, and for that reason does what it does only so far as the other does the same. Action from one side only would be useless, because what is to happen can only be brought about by the means of both. The action has the double entente, not only in the sense that it is an act done to itself as well as to the other, but also inasmuch as it is undivided entirety, the act of the one as well as the other. In this movement, we see the process repeated which came before us as the play of forces. In the present case, however, it is found in consciousness. What in the former had effect only for us, contemplating experience, holds here for the terms themselves. The middle term is self-consciousness, which breaks itself up into the extremes, and each extreme is this interchange of its own determinateness and complete transition into the opposite. While qua consciousness, it no doubt comes itself outside itself, still, in being outside itself, it is at the same time restrained within itself, for it exists for itself, and its self-determination is for consciousness. Consciousness finds that it is immediately is, and not another consciousness, as also that this other is for itself only when it cancels itself as existing for itself, and has self-existence only in the self-existence of the other. Each is the mediating term to the other, through which each mediates and unites itself with itself, and each is to itself and to the other an immediate self-existing reality, which at the same time exists thus for itself only through this mediation. They recognize themselves as mutually recognizing one another. This pure conception of recognition, of duplication of self-consciousness within its unity, we must now consider in the way its process appears for self-consciousness. It will in the first place present the aspect of disparity of the two, or the break-up of the middle term into the extremes which, qua extremes, are opposed to one another, and of which one is merely recognized while the other only recognizes. Self-consciousness is primarily simple existence for self, self-identity by exclusion of every other form of itself. It takes essential nature and absolute object to be ego, and in its immediacy, in this bare fact of its self-existence, it is individual. That which is other for it stands as unessential object, as object with the impress and character of negation. But the other is also a self-consciousness. An individual makes its appearance in antithesis to an individual. Appearing thus in their immediacy, they are for each other in the manner of ordinary objects. They are independent individual forms, modes of consciousness that have not arisen above the bare level of life, for the existent object here has been determined as life. They are, moreover, forms of consciousness which have not yet accomplished for one another the process of absolute abstraction, of uprooting all immediate existence, and of being merely the bare negative fact of self-identical consciousness. Or, in other words, they have not yet revealed themselves to each other as existing purely for themselves, i.e. as self-consciousness. Each is indeed certain of its own self, but not of the other. Hence, its own certainty of itself is still without truth. For its truth would be merely that its own individual existence for itself would be shown to it to be an independent object, or, which is the same thing, that the object would be exhibited as this pure certainty of itself. By the notion of recognition, however, this is not possible except in the form that as other is for it, so it is for the other. Each in itself, through its own action, and again through the action of the other, achieves this pure abstraction of existence for self. The presentation of itself, however, as pure abstraction of self-consciousness, consists in showing itself as a pure negation of its objective form, or in showing that it is fettered to no determinate existence, that it is not bound at all by the particularity everywhere characteristic of existence as such, and is not tied up with life. The process of bringing all this out involves a twofold action on the part of the other, and action on the part of itself. Insofar as it is the other's action, each aims at the destruction and death of the other. But in this there is implicated also the second kind of action, self-activity, for each implies that it risks its own life. The relation of both self-consciousnesses in this way is so constituted that they prove themselves and each other through a life and death struggle. They must enter into this struggle, for they must bring the certainty of themselves, the certainty of being for themselves, to the level of objective truth, and make this a fact both in the case of the other and in the case of their own as well. And it is solely by risking life that freedom is obtained. Only thus it is tied and proved that the essential nature of self-consciousness is not bare existence. It is not the merely immediate form in which at first it makes its appearance. It is not its mere absorption in the expanse of life. Rather, it is thereby guaranteed that there is nothing present but what might be taken as a vanishing moment, that self-consciousness is merely pure self-existence, being for itself. The individual who has not staked his life may no doubt be recognized as a person, but he has not attained the truth of this recognition as an independent self-consciousness. In the same way, each must aim at the death of the other, as it risks his own life thereby, for that other is to it of no more worth than itself. The other's reality is presented to the former as an external other, as an outside self. It must cancel that externality. The other is a purely existent consciousness and entangled in manifold ways. It must regard its otherness as pure existence for itself, or as absolute negation. This trying and testing, however, by struggle to the death, cancels both the truth which it was to result from it, and therewith the certainty of self altogether. For just as life is the natural position of consciousness, independence without absolute negativity, so death is the natural negation of consciousness, negation without independence, which thus remains without the requisite significance of actual recognition. Through death, doubtless, there has arisen the certainty that both did stake their life and held it lightly, both in their own case and in the case of the other. But that is not for what those who underwent this struggle. They cancel their consciousnesses, which had its place in this alien element of natural existence. In other words, they cancel themselves and are sublated as terms or extremes seeking to have existence on their own account. But along with this, there vanishes from the play of change the essential moment, viz., that of breaking up into extremes with opposite characteristics, and the middle term collapses into a lifeless unity which is broken up into lifeless extremes, merely existent and not opposed. And the two do not mutually give and receive one another back from each other through consciousness. They let one another go quite indifferently, like things. Their act is abstraction negation, not the negation characteristic of consciousness, which cancels in such a way that it preserves and maintains what is sublated, and thereby survives its being sublated. In this experience of self-consciousness, becomes aware that life is essential to it as pure self-consciousness. In immediate self-consciousness, the simple ego is absolute object, which, however, is, for us, or in itself, absolute mediation, and has as its essential moment substantial and solid independence. The dissolution of that simple unity is the result of the first experience. Through this there is posited a pure self-consciousness, and a consciousness which is not purely for itself, but for another, i.e., as an existent consciousness, consciousness in the form of shape and thinghood. Both moments are essential, since in the first instance they are unlike and opposed, and their reflection into unity has not yet come to light. They stand as two opposed forms or modes of consciousness. The one is independent, whose essential nature is to be for itself. The other is dependent, whose essence is life or existence for another. The former is the master or lord, the latter is the bondsman. The master is the consciousness that exists for itself, but no longer merely the general notion of existence for self. Rather, it is consciousness which, while existing in its own account, is mediated with itself through another consciousness, viz., bound up with an independent being, or with thinghood in general. The master brings himself into relation to both these moments, to a thing as such, the object of desire, and to the consciousness whose essential character is thinghood, And since the master, qua notion of self-consciousness, is A, an immediate relation of self-existence, but is now moreover at the same time B, mediation, or a being for itself, which is for itself only through another, he, the master, stands in relation A, immediately to both, B, mediately to each through the other. The master relates himself to the bondsman immediately through their independent existence, for that is precisely what keeps the bondsman in thrall. It is his chain from which he could not in the struggle get away, and for that reason he proves himself dependent, shows that his independence consists in being a thing. The master, however, is the power controlling this state of existence, for he has shown in the struggle that he holds existence to be merely something negative. Since he is the power dominating the negative nature of existence, while this existence again is the power controlling the other, the bondsman, the master holds, par consequence, the other in subordination. In this way, the master relates himself to the thing mediately through the bondsman. The bondsman, being a self-consciousness in the broad sense, also takes up a negative attitude to things and cancels them. But the thing is, at the same time, independent for him, and in consequence he cannot, with all his negating, get so far as to annihilate it outright and be done with it. That is to say, he merely works on it. To the master, on the other hand, by means of this mediating process, belongs the immediate relation, the sense of pure negation of it. In other words, he gets the enjoyment. What mere desire does not attain, he now succeeds in attaining, viz., to have done with the thing and to find satisfaction and enjoyment. Desire alone did not get the length of this, because of the independence of the thing. The master, however, who has interposed the bondsman between it and himself, thereby relates himself merely to the dependence of the thing, and enjoys it without qualification and without reserve. This aspect of its independence he leaves to the bondsman who labours upon it. In these two moments, the master gets his recognition through another consciousness, for in them the latter affirms itself as unessential both by working upon the thing and, on the other hand, by the fact of being dependent on a determinate existence. In neither case can this other get the mastery over existence and succeed in absolutely negating it. We have thus here this moment of recognition, viz., that the other consciousness cancels itself as self-existent, and ipso facto itself does what the first does to it. In the same way, we have the other moment. This action on the part of the second is the action proper of the first. For what is done by the bondsman is properly an action on the part of the master. The latter exists only for himself in his essential nature. He is the negative power without qualification, a power to which the thing is naught, and thus is absolutely essential action in this situation, while the bondsman's is not so. His is an unessential activity. But for recognition proper, there is needed the moment that what the master does to the other, he should also do to himself, and what the bondsman does to himself, he should also do to the other also. On that account, a form of recognition has arisen that is one-sided and unequal. In all this, the inessential consciousness is, for the master, the object which embodies the truth of his certainty of himself. But it is evident that this object does not correspond to its notion. For just where the master has effectively achieved lordship, he really finds that something has come about quite different from an independent consciousness. It is not independent, but rather a dependent consciousness that he has achieved. He is thus not assured of self-existence as his truth. He finds that his truth is rather the unessential consciousness and the fortuitous unessential action of that consciousness. The truth of the independent consciousness is accordingly the consciousness of the bondsman. This doubtless appears in the first instance outside it, and not as the truth of self-consciousness. But just as lordship showed its essential nature to be the reverse of what it wants to be, so too bondage will, when completed, pass into the opposite of what it immediately is. Being a consciousness repressed within itself, it will enter into itself and change around into real and true independence. We have seen what bondage is only in relation to lordship, but it is a self-consciousness, and we have now to consider what it is in this regard in and for itself. In the first instance, the master is taken to be the essential reality for the state of bondage. Hence, for it, the truth is the independent consciousness existing for itself, although this truth is not yet taken as inherent in bondage itself. Still, it does in fact contain within it this truth of pure negativity and self-existence, because it has experience of this reality within it. For this self-consciousness was not in peril and fear for this element or that, nor for this or that moment of time. It was afraid for its entire being. It felt the fear of death. It was in mortal terror of its sovereign master. It has been in that experience, melted into its inmost soul. It has trembled throughout its every fibre. The stable foundation of its whole being have quaked within it. This complete perturbation of its entire substance, this absolute dissolution of all its stability into fluid continuity is, however, the simple ultimate nature of self-consciousness, absolute negativity, pure self-referent existence, which consequently is involved in this type of consciousness. This moment of pure existence is moreover a fact for it, for in the master this moment is consciously his object. Further, this bondsman's consciousness is not only his total dissolution in a general way. In serving and toiling, the bondsman actually carries this out. By serving, he cancels in every particular moment his dependence on and attachment to natural existence, and by his work removes this existence away. The feeling of absolute power, however, realized both in general and in the particular form of service, is only dissolution implicitly, and albeit the fear of his Lord is the beginning of wisdom, consciousness is not therein aware of being self-existent. Through work and labour, however, this consciousness of the bondsman comes to itself. In the moment which corresponds to desire in the case of the master's consciousness, the aspect of the non-essential relation to the thing seemed to fall to the lot of the servant, since the thing there retained its independence. Desire has reserved to itself the pure negating of the object, and thereby unalloyed feelings of itself. This satisfaction, however, just for that reason, is itself only a state of evanescence, for it lacks objectivity or subsistence. Labour, on the other hand, is desire restrained and checked, evanescence delayed and postponed. In other words, labour shapes and fashions the thing. The negative relation to the object passes into the form of the object, into something that is permanent and remains, because it is just for the labourer that the object has independence. This negative mediating agency, this activity giving shape and form, is at the same time the individual existence, the pure self-existence of that consciousness, which now in the work it does is externalized and passes into the condition of permanence. The consciousness that toils and serves accordingly comes by this means to view that independent being as itself. But again, shaping or forming the object has not only the positive significance that the bondsman becomes thereby aware of himself as factually and objectively self-existent. This type of consciousness has also a negative import, in contrast with its first movement, the element of fear. For in shaping the thing, it only becomes aware of its own proper negativity, its existence on its own account as an object, through the fact that it cancels the actual form from confronting it. But this objective element is precisely the alien, external reality before which it trembled. Now, however, it destroys this extraneous alien negative, affirms and sets itself up as a negative in the element of permanence, and thereby becomes aware of being objectively for itself. In the master, this self-existence is felt to be another, is only external. In fear, the self-existence is present implicitly. In fashioning the thing, self-existence comes to be felt explicitly as its own proper being, and it attains the consciousness that itself exists in its own right and on its own account, an und für sich. By the fact that the form is objectified, it does not become something other than the consciousness moulding the thing through work, for just that form is its pure self-existence, which therein becomes truly realized. Thus precisely in labour, where there seemed to be merely some outsider's mind and ideas involved, the bondsman becomes aware, through his own rediscovery of himself, of having and being a mind of his own. For this reflection of self into self, the two moments fear and service in general, and also that of the formative activity, are necessary, and at the same time both must exist in a universal manner. Without the discipline of service and obedience, fear remains formal and does not spread over the whole known reality of existence. Without the formative activity shaping the thing, fear remains inward and mute, and consciousness does not become objective for itself. Should consciousness shape and form the thing without the initial statement of absolute fear, then it has merely a vain and futile mind of its own. For its form or negativity is not negativity per se, and hence its formative activity cannot furnish the consciousness of itself as essentially real. If it has endured not absolute fear but merely some slight anxiety, the negative reality has remained external to it. Its substance has not been through and through affected thereby. Since the entire content of its natural consciousness has not tottered and shaken, it is still inherently a determinate mode of being, a having a mind of its own, der Eigensinn. It is simply stubbornness, Eigensinn, a type of freedom which does not get beyond the attitude of bondage. The less the pure form can become its essential nature, the less that form, as overspreading and controlling particulars, a universal formative activity, an absolute notion, is rather a piece of cleverness, which has mastery within a certain range, but does not wield universal power and dominate the entire objective reality. End of Chapter 4a, recording by Morris in Arlesey, Bedfordshire.